Hello everyone. Today I'm sharing a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty. What happens when the person you sleep next to every night is actually a stranger? The air in the master bedroom felt thick, like breathing through wet velvet. Elena stood in the dark, her fingers trembling against the cold steel of the floor safe. She shouldn't have been looking. She knew that. But the intuition, that nagging, persistent itch in the back of her brain, it wouldn't let her sleep. Just one more turn, she whispered to the shadows, her voice barely a ghost of a sound. Just one more, and the truth will be mine. She wiped a bead of cold sweat from her forehead, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The room smelled of stale lavender and the metallic tang of the safe. She turned the dial. Click. 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 The heavy door swung open with a groan that sounded like a scream in the silence. She reached in, her hand brushing against old tax returns and jewelry boxes, until her fingertips hit something crisp. Something different. She pulled it out. A piece of paper. Not a receipt. Not a bill. It was a marriage license. But the names weren't hers. It was Julian. And it was a woman named Sarah. Dated 3 years ago. Elena felt the floor tilt. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the sound of a single piece of paper fluttering in the dark. It can't be, she breathed, the words catching in her throat. It's just a mistake. It has to be a mistake. But the ink was real. The seal was official. Her mind raced, trying to find a way to make this a dream, but the coldness of the floor beneath her knees was too real. She was no longer a wife, she was a trespasser in her own life. Was every kiss a lie? Was every I love you just a script he practiced in the mirror? She stared at the document, the letters blurring as tears finally began to sting her eyes. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt like a predator waiting to strike. She felt the weight of the decade she had invested, a decade that was now revealed to be nothing more than a carefully constructed stage set for a man who lived a double life. Every memory of their shared holidays, every quiet morning, every whispered promise, it all felt tainted, poisoned by the existence of this other woman, this Sarah. The darkness of the room seemed to press in on her, suffocating and absolute. She realized the man she loved was a stranger she had never truly known. The next morning, the sun was far too bright. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their kitchen, illuminating every polished marble surface and every perfectly placed vase. It was a house built on appearances. To the neighbors in Oak Crest, Elena and Julian Vance were the gold standard. They were the couple you modeled your life after. Today was their 10th anniversary. Tonight, Elena was scheduled to give a speech at the charity gala, a tribute to a decade of unwavering partnership. She sat at the island, staring at her tea. The steam rose in delicate curls, mocking her. 10 years, she whispered to herself, the words feeling like lead in her mouth. 10 years of building a monument to nothing. She gripped the handle of her porcelain teacup so hard her knuckles turned white. The porcelain felt unnaturally cold against her skin. Julian walked in, looking every bit the successful architect in his tailored charcoal suit. He leaned down, kissing her temple. His touch, once a comfort, now felt like a violation. He smelled of peppermint and expensive cologne. He looked at her with those warm, brown eyes, the eyes that had convinced her she was losing her mind every time she asked why he was late. "You okay, honey?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "You look a little pale. Are you nervous about the speech?" Elena forced a smile. It was a practiced movement, a muscle memory of deception. "Just tired," she lied. The irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She looked at him, really looked at him, searching for the man she thought she knew. but all she saw was a stranger wearing her husband's skin. She realized then that the paranoia wasn't a sickness. It was a warning. And she was finally listening. "I'll be fine, Julian," she added, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "I just need more coffee." He chuckled, a sound that used to be charming but now sounded like grinding stones. "That's my girl," he said, patting her hand. She watched him walk away, her eyes tracing the line of his shoulders, wondering how many other secrets were hidden in the architecture of his life. She wondered if he was thinking about Chicago. She wondered if he was thinking about her. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, now felt like a stage set, waiting for the curtain to rise on a tragedy. She looked at the pristine white marble, so clean and unblemished, and realized it was just like their marriage, a beautiful, polished surface covering a hollow, dark void. Every piece of fine china, every designer light fixture, felt like a prop in a play she no longer wanted to act in. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to smash the teacup against the floor, to hear the sound of something real breaking. She simply sat there, frozen in her role, waiting for the performance to begin. Elena didn't cry. Not yet. The grief was there, a cold weight in her chest, but it had been replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She went to his study. The room smelled of old books and leather, the scent of a man who had nothing to hide. She searched the desk, her movements precise and clinical. She found it in the very back, tucked behind a stack of blueprints. A second phone. It was slim, black, and completely different from his usual device. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed the home button. It wasn't locked. He was careless. Or perhaps, he was so confident in his lies that he no longer felt the need to hide. "Who is Leo?" she whispered, the name tasting like poison. She scrolled through the messages. They weren't just messages, they were a second life. "Leo loves the new park," one read. "Can't wait for you to come home to us," said another. Then, she found the photo. A little boy, no more than 4 years old, laughing in a sun-drenched park in Chicago. He had Julian's eyes. The same mischievous, dark eyes that Elena had fallen in love with a decade ago. The realization hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just an affair. It was a whole other family. A whole other wife. A whole other existence, built on the ruins of her own. She sat in his chair, the leather cold against her skin, and realized she wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a witness. "You thought I was crazy," she muttered, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce heat. "You thought I was losing my mind." She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white, as the weight of the betrayal settled into her bones. The ticking of the clock in the corner seemed to grow louder, counting down the minutes until the gala, until the moment the mask would finally slip. She wasn't just a victim. She was a hunter, and she had just found her prey. She stared at the boy's face on the screen, his laughter frozen in a digital moment that felt like a mockery of her own life. She felt a sudden, violent urge to smash the phone against the mahogany desk, to shatter the evidence of his betrayal into 1,000 pieces. But she didn't. She simply turned the screen off, the darkness of the device reflecting her own hollow expression. The hunt had begun. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, and walked to the window. The afternoon sun was casting long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawn, much like the shadows Julian had cast over her life for years. She realized that every consulting trip to Chicago, every late-night phone call, every excuse about a deadline, it had all been a brick in the wall of the second, secret life. She wasn't just fighting for her marriage, she was fighting for her very reality. The world she thought she lived in was a fiction, and she was the only one who had been reading the wrong script. The gala was a sea of silk, diamonds, and false smiles. The ballroom of the Grand Hotel was breathtaking, draped in gold and white, but to Elena, it felt like a gilded cage. She wore a gown of midnight blue, the color of a bruise. The fabric felt heavy and restrictive, like armor she hadn't asked to wear. Every time someone approached her, every time a socialite whispered, "You and Julian are such an inspiration," she felt a wave of nausea. She was standing in the center of a lie. Julian was by her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. To anyone watching, he was the devoted husband, the pillar of the community. He leaned in, whispering in her ear, "You look stunning, darling. Just a few more minutes, and then we can escape." His breath was warm, but his words felt like ice. "Are you alright, Elena?" a woman in pearls asked, her eyes scanning Elena's face for a flaw. "You seem distant." Elena forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just the excitement, Margaret. It's a wonderful night, isn't it?" She took a sip of champagne, the bubbles stinging her throat. She looked around the room, seeing the faces of people she had known for years. They were all part of it. They were part of the performance. They saw the perfection, but they didn't see the rot. She felt a desperate urge to scream, to grab the microphone and tell them all the truth. To tell them that the man they admired was a ghost, a man with 2 lives and 2 hearts. But she didn't. She stood there, she smiled, and she let them toast to her happiness. She was waiting. She was gathering her strength. She adjusted the strap of her gown, her fingers trembling slightly. Just a little longer, she thought, her eyes fixed on the podium. Just a little longer. The world will see you for what you are. She felt the weight of the diamonds around her neck, a glittering noose. The music swelled, a grand, sweeping orchestral piece that felt like it was mocking her very existence. She was a prisoner in a palace of lies, and the executioner was the man holding her hand. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats, a cloying sweetness that made her want to gag. She watched the light catch on the crystal chandeliers, the sparkling brilliance feeling like 1,000 tiny eyes judging her silence. Every laugh from the crowd felt like a serrated edge against her skin. She wondered how many other people in this room were living their own carefully curated fictions. Was the man in the corner also hiding a second family? Was the woman in the red dress also a stranger to her own husband? The thought was a dizzying whirlpool. She felt small, insignificant, a mere prop in Julian's grand production of success. But beneath the humiliation, a cold, hard core of resolve was forming. She wasn't just going to endure this night, she was going to use it. She was going to turn this ballroom into a courtroom, and Julian would be the one on trial. The lights dimmed. It was time. Elena stepped up to the podium, the spotlight feeling like a searchlight. She looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Julian sat in the front row, smiling, his eyes full of a pride that now felt sickening. She opened her mouth to speak, to deliver the rehearsed lines about love and endurance. But before a single word could escape, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A small figure stood there, silhouetted against the bright hallway light. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 4. He looked lost, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. He was wearing a small, slightly wrinkled suit. In his hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, a child's drawing of a man, a woman, and a boy, all holding hands under a bright yellow sun. The room went silent. A silence so profound it felt heavy. The boy took a step forward, his voice small but clear in the sudden quiet. "Daddy," he called out. The word cut through the room like a knife. Elena saw Julian's face drain of all color. The smile didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Julian," someone whispered from the front row. "Is that?" The boy wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking straight at Julian. "Daddy, Mommy said I could come find you. I missed you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the room turned from the child to Julian, and then, slowly, to Elena. The lie hadn't just cracked. It had shattered. Elena felt the heat of the spotlight, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a searchlight. It felt like a beacon. She looked down at the boy, then at the drawing, then at the man she had once called her world. The pieces were all there. The evidence was undeniable. The truth was standing in the middle of the ballroom, wearing a tiny suit and holding a drawing of a life that didn't include her. She felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over her. The boy's eyes were so full of innocence, so completely unaware of the wreckage he had just caused. She looked at Julian, whose mouth was hanging open, his composure completely disintegrated. The man who had built a life on lies was finally, irrevocably, exposed. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum of shock. She could see the socialites leaning in, their mouths agape, their eyes darting between the child and the man in the front row. The silence was no longer just quiet, it was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating presence that demanded an explanation. Elena felt the weight of the moment, the sheer, terrifying gravity of the truth. She looked at the boy's small, trembling hands, and then at the drawing, the bright, yellow sun that mocked the darkness of this room. It was all so simple, so devastatingly clear. The architecture of Julian's life had finally collapsed, and she was the only one left standing in the debris. For a heartbeat, Elena thought she might faint. But then, something inside her shifted. The grief didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It became a weapon. She didn't step down. She didn't hide. Instead, she leaned into the microphone. The feedback hummed, a sharp, electric sound that demanded attention. She looked down at Julian. He was trembling, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. He looked small. He looked pathetic. "It seems," Elena said, her voice steady and unnervingly calm, "that we have an uninvited guest. And a very important revelation." She stepped away from the podium, walking toward the boy. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She knelt in her midnight blue gown, ignoring the dirt on the floor, and looked the boy in the eyes. "Hello, Leo," she whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. The boy blinked, startled. "Do you know my daddy?" she asked. The boy nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. "He's my daddy. He lives in Chicago with Mommy." Elena stood up, turning to face the room. She looked at the socialites, the donors, the friends. "This is the man you all admire," she said, gesturing to Julian. "The man who builds beautiful structures, while his own life is built on a foundation of sand. A man who has a wife in this room, and a wife in Chicago. A man who has a son he pretends doesn't exist." She held up the child's drawing, the colors bright and mocking against the dark ballroom. "Look at the truth," she commanded. The room erupted. Not in cheers, but in a chaotic, terrifying roar of scandal. Julian tried to stand, to speak, to lie, but the words died in his throat. "Elena, stop. Please," he choked out, his face a mask of desperation. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She watched as the socialites pulled away from him, as the cameras flashed, capturing his downfall in high definition. He was no longer the architect. He was the wreckage, and she was the storm that had brought him down. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold, electric power that made her feel invincible. Every flash of a camera, every gasp from the crowd, was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. She had spent years being the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect partner. Now, she was the perfect executioner. And as she stood there, bathed in the light of her own truth, she realized she had never felt more alive. The power was intoxicating, a sharp contrast to the years of being gaslit and made to feel small. She watched the panic in Julian's eyes, the way he tried to find a way out. A way to spin this, a way to lie his way back into their social circle. But there were no more lies left to tell. The truth was out, loud and clear, broadcast to everyone who mattered. She felt a strange sense of peace amidst the chaos, a clarity that only comes when the final mask is stripped away. She wasn't just destroying him, she was reclaiming herself. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of before. It was the silence of a tomb. The gala was over. The news had traveled through the city like wildfire. By midnight, Julian's firm had issued a statement. By 1, his partners had frozen his accounts. By 2, he was a pariah. He sat in the armchair, his head in his hands, the man who had tried to live 2 lives and ended up with none. Elena stood by the window, watching the rain. The droplets raced down the glass like tears. She had filed for divorce an hour ago. She had already contacted a lawyer who specialized in high-asset betrayal. She wasn't just leaving him, she was dismantling him. Every asset, every secret, every lie would be stripped away in the courtroom. "You can't do this, Elena," Julian's voice drifted from the shadows, broken and hollow. "We can talk about this. We can fix it." Elena didn't even turn around. She watched a single raindrop race down the glass. "There is nothing left to fix, Julian," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You broke the foundation. Now, you get to live in the ruins." She felt no joy in his destruction, only a profound, hollow sense of justice. He had thought he was a master of shadows, but he had forgotten that shadows only exist when there is light. And Elena had turned on every light in the house. She looked at the marriage license, still sitting on the coffee table. It was just paper. But it had been the match that burned his world to the ground. She realized then that she wasn't the victim anymore. She was the survivor. And survivors don't look back. She gripped her suitcase, the leather cool and firm in her hand, and prepared to step into a life that was finally, terrifyingly, her own. She could hear him sobbing in the other room, a pathetic, rhythmic sound that only served to confirm her decision. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by this broken stranger. She didn't feel pity. She only felt the weight of her own freedom, heavy and precious as gold. The rain continued to lash against the windows, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo the finality of her choice. She thought of the boy, Leo, and hoped that his world, though shaken, would eventually find its own kind of stability. She thought of Sarah, the woman who had unknowingly shared a life with her husband, and felt a strange, distant pang of empathy. They were both victims of Julian's grand design, 2 women caught in the web of his deception. But as she turned away from the window, she knew she couldn't stay to help them. She had to save herself first. She had to build something real, something that wasn't based on a foundation of lies. As the first gray light of dawn crept into the room, Julian approached her. He looked broken, his eyes red-rimmed, his expensive shirt wrinkled. "Elena," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please. We can fix this. I'll leave her. I'll leave everything. Just don't take everything from me." Elena turned to face him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked nothing. She looked as empty as the house around them. She walked toward him, and for a moment, he thought she might embrace him. He reached out, his hands trembling. But she only reached out to straighten his collar. A gesture of perfect, terrifying grace. "I forgive you, Julian," she said, her voice as smooth and cold as marble. He let out a sob of relief, a broken sound of hope. "Thank you, Elena. Thank you." But she wasn't finished. "I forgive you for being exactly who you are," she continued, her eyes locking onto his with a chilling intensity. "And because I forgive you, I'm going to make sure you never have to worry about a second life again. Because you won't have a first one either. She picked up her bag and walked past him. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The silence she left behind was louder than any scream. She had given him mercy, but it was the kind of mercy that leaves a person freezing in the dark. Forever. The morning air was biting, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the night before. As she stepped out of the front door, the heavy oak thudded shut with a finality that echoed through the empty street. She didn't feel the cold. She didn't feel the fear. She only felt the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart, a drum signaling the start of a new, solitary life. That's the story. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon with more incredible true stories. Join me next time for another tale of secrets, lies, and redemption. She walked down the driveway, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, a sound that felt like a countdown to her new beginning. The sky was a bruised purple, transitioning into a pale, unforgiving gray. She didn't look at the house, the beautiful, hollow monument to a lie. She looked straight ahead, toward the horizon, where the sun would eventually rise, whether she was ready or not. She felt a strange, light sensation in her chest, as if the weight of the last 10 years had finally been lifted, leaving her hollow but free. The world was vast, and for the first time in a decade, it belonged entirely to her. She was no longer a wife, no longer a partner, no longer a victim. She was simply Elena, and that was more than enough.